You're standing at the edge of a drained swamp in southern Iraq. The mud cracks under your feet, and somewhere beneath it lies the answer to a question that broke every theory I ever trusted. Who were the Sumerians? Not the myth, the people, the blood. For 100 years, we were told they came from somewhere else. Invaders, outsiders who arrived and handed civilization to a backward world. That story is wrong. A single DNA study proved it, and almost no one noticed. I found it buried in a journal called BMC Evolutionary Biology, published in 2011 by a researcher named Nadia Al-Zahery. What she found rewrote everything, and by the end of this, you'll understand why the truth was standing in that marsh the whole time. Let me take you back to the night this started for me. It was almost 2 in the morning, and I was reading a museum caption in Philadelphia, of all places, at the Penn Museum's Mesopotamia page. It said, "The Sumerians appeared." And I remember the word appeared. Not arrived, not migrated. Appeared. As if a whole people simply switched on in the fertile mud between 2 rivers, already knowing how to build cities, already writing, already counting the stars. I sat back in my chair and I thought, that is not how history works. People come from somewhere. So where did they come from? That single word pulled me into 3 years of chasing a ghost. Here is what you need to understand about the Sumerians first, because it makes the mystery real instead of abstract. Around 3,500 years before the Common Era, in the flat, scorched plain of what is now southern Iraq, the first true cities on earth rose out of the ground: Uruk, Eridu, Lagash. These were not villages. Uruk, at its peak, held somewhere between 40,000 and 80,000 people inside a wall the Sumerians said was built by Gilgamesh himself. They invented writing. They invented the wheel for pottery and then for carts. They divided the hour into 60 minutes and the circle into 360 degrees, and you still use their math every single time you look at a clock, and nobody could tell me where they came from. That was the part that kept me awake. Every other ancient people leaves a trail. You can follow the Indo-Europeans across the steppe by their words and their graves. You can track the Bantu expansion across Africa, but the Sumerians sat at the very beginning of recorded history like a locked door with no hallway leading up to it. Their language made it worse. Sumerian is what linguists call an isolate. It is related to nothing. Not Arabic, not Hebrew, not Persian, not Turkish, not any tongue alive or dead that we have ever identified. Imagine a language with no cousins, no parents, no siblings, floating alone in time, so the scholars did what scholars do. They guessed. And their guesses, when I started reading them closely, all pointed away from Iraq. That is the piece that hooked me. From the very beginning, the experts assumed the Sumerians were not local. They assumed these people were foreigners who walked in from somewhere more impressive, because surely, the thinking went, the first civilization could not have simply grown from the marsh people who were already there. Let me show you exactly how deep that assumption ran, because it is older and stranger than you think. Back in the 1800s, when European archaeologists first began digging into the mounds of Iraq, they found the tablets and they could not read the strange script. When they finally cracked it, they realized the language underneath the later Babylonian writing was something older and completely alien, and their reaction was telling. A man named Joseph Oppert in 1869 was the one who gave these people the name Sumerian, taken from an old royal title. But almost immediately, the debate began. Where did such a people originate? And the early answers were shaped less by evidence than by a bias. None of them would admit out loud. They looked east to the mountains of Iran. They looked further east, all the way to the Indus Valley in what is now Pakistan. Some looked towards Central Asia. A few, reading the Sumerians' own myths, noticed that several of their stories spoke of a homeland across the water, a place the gods came from, and they wondered if the Sumerians had arrived by sea from the Persian Gulf, or from an island, or from some drowned coast now under the water. There was even a persistent idea, repeated in book after book, that the Sumerians descended from the high mountains because their temples, the great step towers called ziggurats, looked like artificial mountains. The logic went, they build fake mountains, Therefore, they must miss real ones. Therefore, they came from a mountainous land. I actually found that argument compelling at first. That is what I want you to understand. I was not standing above these theories laughing at them. I was down inside them, nodding along, because the ziggurat idea has a kind of poetry to it, and the sea origin idea fits the myths, and the mountain idea explains the isolation of the language. Every theory answered something. That is exactly why the whole thing felt so solid to me in the beginning, and exactly why it took me so long to notice that not one of these theories had a single body behind it. Not one bone. Not one grave that anybody could point to and say, here, this is a Sumerian who was born somewhere else and moved in. It was all inference, all shape and shadow, all argument built on argument. But something had shifted underneath all that old speculation, and I didn't know it yet. For most of the 20th century, the origin question was unanswerable by design because the only tools were pottery styles and language and skull measurements, let me be blunt, were often junk science dressed up in calipers. You cannot find where a people came from by measuring the width of their foreheads. So the debate just circled foreign origin, foreign, local, decade after decade, with no way to settle it. Then the science changed. And this is where my search stopped being about dusty books and started being about something you carry in every cell of your body right now. Genetics arrived. The ability to read ancient and living DNA and trace lineages back through thousands of years. And I remember the exact moment I realized this could crack the whole thing open. Because I thought, if the Sumerians really walked in from Iran or India or across the Gulf, their DNA would carry the fingerprint of that homeland. And if they didn't, if they were local all along, then the entire 100-year assumption was a fantasy. The mud would finally speak. So I went looking for the study that had done it, and what I found stunned me, not because there were dozens, but because there was almost nothing. Here is the brutal problem I ran into, and it is the reason this mystery survived into our lifetime. You cannot easily get ancient DNA out of southern Iraq. DNA is fragile, heat destroys it, time destroys it, and southern Mesopotamia is one of the hottest, wettest, most punishing environments on Earth for preserving genetic material. The bones rot, the molecules shatter. For decades, geneticists could pull clean ancient DNA out of cold European caves and Siberian permafrost, but the cradle of civilization itself stayed silent because its own climate had cooked the evidence. So the direct approach was closed. You could not, for the most part, dig up a Sumerian and read him. That should have been a dead end for a while. For me, it was. I hit that wall and I sat there thinking the question might simply be unanswerable forever, that the Sumerians would keep their secret because their own soil had eaten the proof. I almost let it go. But then I found the workaround, and it was so simple and so bold that I could not believe more people were not talking about it. If you cannot read the ancient dead, read the living. Because in the marshes of southern Iraq, in the exact place where the first cities rose, a people were still living almost the same way the Sumerians did. They were called the Madan, the Marsh Arabs. And a small group of researchers had a radical idea. What if these marsh dwellers were not newcomers? What if they were the leftovers, the direct descendants, the Sumerians who never left? That idea became a study, and that study became the center of my obsession. If this kind of buried evidence is what keeps you awake at night, I want to tell you about something I put together for exactly that reason. I wrote 3 books, First Threshold, Deep Signal, and Hidden Systems, that go deeper into the cases where the official story and the actual evidence don't line up, cases like this one, where the truth was sitting in plain sight the entire time and nobody wanted to look. You can find all 3 linked in the description at lowestorigins.org. Each one is $97, and every page is built the way this video is built. No clean stories, no comfortable answers, just the thread pulled all the way to the end. If you've made it this far into this video, you already know whether that's for you. The paper was published in 2011 in the journal BMC Evolutionary Biology. The lead author was Nadia Al-Zahery, working with a team including the well-known geneticist Ornella Cimino and others out of Italy and Iraq. The title alone gave me chills when I read it because it said out loud what everyone else only whispered. It was called roughly a search for the genetic footprints of the Sumerians. They went straight at it. They collected DNA samples from 143 Marsh Arab men and compared them against samples from the wider Iraqi population and neighboring regions. They were hunting for one thing. Was there a foreign signature in these people? A genetic marker that said, your ancestors came from India or Iran or across the sea. If the old theories were right, it would be there. Now, here is where I have to be honest with you, because I promised myself I would never sell you a clean story that reality did not support. When I first read the setup of that study, I braced for it to confirm the foreign origin theory. I genuinely expected the DNA to show an intrusive population of people whose deepest ancestry pointed somewhere far away, because that was the version of history I'd absorbed for years. The Sumerians as the mysterious outsiders who gifted civilization. It is a romantic story. It flatters the idea that greatness has to come from somewhere exotic, and part of me wanted it to be true because a foreign homeland is a better mystery than a local one. A drowned island in the Gulf is a better story than they were always just here. So I want to speak directly to you. If you're sitting there thinking there has to be a simpler answer, that of course the Sumerians came from somewhere, that a people this advanced could not have just emerged from a swamp. I thought exactly that. I want you to stay right here through the next part, because this is the section that took my own certainty and broke it in half. Let me walk you through the ordinary explanation, the way I believed it, and then show you the exact place it fell apart. The conventional story goes like this. Civilization is hard. Writing, cities, irrigation, mathematics, these are enormous leaps. The default assumption for over a century was that such leaps needed an outside spark. A superior people arrives, conquers or mingles with the primitive locals, and lifts them up. Archaeologists even had a name for the layers of culture they found stacked in the Iraqi mounds. Beneath the Sumerian cities, they found an older culture they called the Ubaid, going back to nearly 6,500 years before the Common Era. And the big question became, were the Ubaid people the same as the Sumerians, or did the Sumerians come in later and replace them? If the Sumerians replaced them, that is a foreign invasion, that is migration, that is new blood arriving and pushing the old blood out. And for a long time, that replacement model was the fashionable answer. Pottery styles changed between the layers, and when pottery changes, older archaeologists love to say, a new people arrived. New pots, new people, that was practically a law of the field. And honestly, standing at that point in my research, I bought it. The layers looked like a takeover. The language isolate looked like intruders speaking a tongue no local ever spoke. It all lined up. Then I looked at what the genetics actually showed, and the floor dropped out. Because if a foreign people had swept in and replaced the locals, the DNA of the Marsh Arabs should show a deep foreign core with a thin local layer on top, or a clear signal of a population arriving from the east. That is what replacement looks like in the blood. Instead, the Al-Zahery team found the opposite. The dominant Y chromosome lineage among the Marsh Arabs was a haplogroup called J1, more precisely J1-M267. And this lineage is not some exotic import from India or the Central Asian steppe. It is native to the region. It is the deep, ancient, homegrown signature of the Fertile Crescent and the Arabian environment itself. These men carried in the male line past father to son for thousands of years, the mark of people who had been in that exact landscape since the dawn of farming. That was the first crack, but it got deeper. The study found that the Marsh Arabs carried a genetic profile that was overwhelmingly Middle Eastern and, crucially, autochthonous. That is the word the researchers used, and I had to look it up, and when I did, I felt the hair stand up on my arms. Autochthonous means indigenous, native, originating in the very place where it is found, sprung from the local soil. The genetic data was saying that the people of the marshes were not intruders and not the children of intruders. They were the continuation of a population that had lived in southern Mesopotamia continuously without any grand replacement since deep prehistory. And there was more. The mitochondrial DNA, the female line passed from mother to child, told the same story. The maternal lineages were predominantly Middle Eastern, the kind you find in populations with deep local roots, not the kind that shows a recent sweep of newcomers from a distant land. The foreign signals that did appear from India, from Africa, from further Asia were minor, faint, late additions from centuries of trade along the rivers and the Gulf, not the deep foundation of the population. Do you feel the ground shifting the way I did? Everything I had absorbed, 5 times inverted. The Sumerians were not the mysterious outsiders. They were the locals all along. The swamp did not receive civilization. The swamp grew it. I sat with that for days because it felt too clean, and I have learned not to trust clean. So I pushed back on my own excitement. I asked the hard question. Could the Marsh Arabs simply be later people who moved into the marshes after the Sumerians were long gone, coincidentally carrying local DNA? And here's why that objection fails, and why the researchers built their whole case on the marshes specifically. The southern Iraqi marshes are a world apart. For thousands of years, they were an isolated, self-contained refuge, a maze of reed islands and water channels that outsiders avoided and rarely penetrated. The people who lived there lived almost exactly as the ancient Sumerian art depicts. They built houses of bundled reeds, arched and woven, that are nearly identical to structures carved on Sumerian artifacts, more than 5,000 years old. They herded water buffalo. They fished from slender canoes. They lived on artificial reed islands in the shallows. When I saw a photograph of a Marsh Arab reed house next to a drawing of a Sumerian reed structure from the 4th millennium before the Common Era, I could not tell them apart. Same arches, same bound columns, same shape. Across 5,000 years, unchanged. That is not the footprint of newcomers. That is the footprint of people who never left and never changed, because their watery world sealed them off from the churn of conquest that swept the open plains above. Empires rose and fell on the dry land. Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, Arabs, Mongols, Ottomans, and down in the reeds, the Marsh people just kept living, kept building the same houses, kept passing down the same J, one lineage, father to son, through every one of those empires, as if none of them had happened. The isolation was the whole point. The marsh preserved them like amber preserves an insect. And now I have to tell you the part that turns this from a scientific footnote into something that should make you angry, because it is the part that took me the longest to accept about how knowledge really works. While these people carried in their very blood the answer to the greatest origin mystery in human history, someone tried to erase them. In the 1990s, the Iraqi government under Saddam Hussein deliberately drained the marshes. This was not an accident of drought. It was engineering as warfare. They built massive canals and dikes with names like the so-called Mother of All Battles River to divert the water of the Tigris and Euphrates away from the wetlands. The goal was to punish the marsh people who had sheltered rebels and to destroy their world so they could never hide again. And it worked horrifically. A wetland that had covered something like 9,000 square kilometers, one of the largest in the whole region, was reduced by the year 2000 to less than 10% of its original size. Satellite images from that era show it plainly. A vast dark marsh in the 1970s imagery, and by 2002, a cracked pale desert of salt and dust. Hundreds of thousands of Marsh Arabs were driven from their homes, scattered into refugee camps and foreign countries. Think about what that means. The living archive of the Sumerians, the genetic library that had survived 5,000 years of empires, was nearly wiped out in a single decade, not by nature, but on purpose. The Al-Zahery study, published in 2011, was racing against that erasure. The scientists were sampling a population that had just been shattered and partially scattered, trying to read the footprints of the Sumerians before those footprints were gone for good. They even noted the urgency of it in the way this was a people under threat. That is the moment my obsession turned into something heavier, because I realized this was not just an academic puzzle that nobody had gotten around to solving. The proof had been alive, breathing, living in reed houses the whole time. and the world let it be nearly destroyed while still repeating the old story that the Sumerians came from somewhere else. Now let me pull you all the way down to the bottom of this, to the single detail that ended my search and that I have been waiting the whole video to hand you. When I went back into that 2011 paper and read it not as a summary but line by line, I found the thing that no popular article about the Sumerians ever mentions. The researchers did not just find that the Marsh Arabs were locally rooted, they found specific, identifiable Y chromosome lineages that, in their own words, pointed to a genetic continuity in the region reaching back to the very people who built the first cities. Within that dominant J1 group, they identified a particular sublineage, and its geographic spread and age suggested it had expanded within Mesopotamia itself, not marched in from outside. The mathematics of the mutations, the molecular clock ticking in the Y chromosome, placed the deep roots of these men in the land between the rivers long before the first ziggurat was ever raised. In plain words, the study's conclusion was this: the Marsh Arabs of southern Iraq are, with real genetic support, the modern descendants of the ancient Sumerians. The people who invented writing and the wheel and the 60-minute hour did not vanish and did not come from far away. Their bloodline was still poling canoes through the reeds in the 20th century. It may be poling canoes through the restored marshes today, because since the fall of Saddam Hussein, some of the marshes have been partially reflooded, and some of the Medan have gone home. Let that settle. The greatest civilization mystery, the locked door with no hallway leading to it, had an answer that was never lost in the past. It was hiding in the present, in living people, in a swamp everyone underestimated. And here is the final twist that I think about the most. The reason nobody looked there for so long is the same bias that started the whole thing in the 1800s. The assumption that civilization had to come from somewhere grander than a marsh. The scholars looked to mountains and to India and to drowned islands because they could not believe the answer was the humble reed dwellers who were right in front of them the entire time. They searched the whole world for the Sumerians' homeland and never seriously checked the one place the Sumerians actually lived. The prejudice that sent them looking outward was the exact prejudice that hid the truth. The Sumerians were never who we thought, because we never really thought they could be exactly who they were. Themselves, from that place, belonging to that mud. Al-Zahery and her team put it in careful scientific language, but I will say it the way it hit me at 2 in the morning when the pieces finally locked. The first city builders on Earth were not a mystery, people from beyond the horizon. They were natives of the marsh, and their children survived every empire that ever tried to bury them, right up until one of those empires nearly finished the job in our own lifetime. And a small group of scientists caught the proof just before it slipped underwater forever. So here is what I want you to carry out of this. For 100 years we were told the fathers of civilization came from somewhere else, and the truth was that they never left home at all, and we almost let their descendants be erased before we bothered to read the answer written in their blood. If you're the kind of person who feels the itch when an official story is just a little too smooth, who suspects the tidy explanation is often just the comfortable one, then you already understand why I could not let this go. You and I are wired the same way. We would rather chase the truth into a drained swamp than accept a caption that says a whole people simply appeared. Now I want to hear from you, and I mean this specifically. Those reed houses, the ones that look identical across 5,000 years, the ones I could not tell apart from the ancient carvings. When you picture a bloodline surviving unbroken from the builders of the first cities down to a fisherman poling through the reeds last century, does that make you believe the Marsh people are the last Sumerians? Or do you still think the answer lies somewhere out beyond the Gulf? Tell me in the comments, and tell me where in the world you are watching from, because I read them, and the people who find this channel tend to be exactly the kind I want to talk to. If you made it this far, you are not a casual viewer. You are one of us. The ones who keep pulling on the threads that everyone else swears are already tied off. Stay with me, because the next case I have been chasing involves a language even older and stranger than Sumerian, carved into stone at a site that was deliberately buried by the very people who built it thousands of years before writing was supposed to exist. Someone went to enormous effort to hide it. I want to know why, and I think, like this one, the answer is going to be nothing like what we were told. I'm leaving you right there at the edge of that marsh, but there's more, and it's for the people who stay with me. Inside the Unexplained Society, I pick up exactly where this stopped, marker by marker. You can ask me your own questions, and a real person answers, not a machine. And thousands of mystery lovers like you are already there beside you. Just point your phone at the code, cancel anytime, one click. Now, if the Sumerians surprised you, wait until you see this. Right here, I'll show you a discovery at Göbekli Tepe so strange that scientists still can't explain it. Let's uncover it together, starting now.